Welcome to my channel, Purposeful Play, where I talk about all things early childhood education. I'm Danielle, and today I want to talk to you about multilingual learners and how you can support them in your preschool classroom. So let's get started. Usually before I record a video, I take some notes about what I want to, those points I wanted to touch during my video when I'm recording it. I did not do that this time. I've got like 10 minutes, 12 minutes before I need to be off doing something else. And I had this idea, so I was like, I'm just gonna quick record it and we'll see how it ends up. So stick with me. First thing, one of the most important things when working with multilingual learners is getting to know their families and those children. That's really actually important for all families, but really in particular with multilingual learners. You want to know what languages are being spoken at home by the child and also the family members. You want to get to know what families, their hopes and dreams are for their child during that school year. What do the children like to do? What are their interests? What are they good at? What is an area that, I don't want to say a weakness, but an opportunity for growth? What does this child do when they feel sad or scared or those strong emotions? So as I'm saying these out loud, these are things that you really need to know about all children. But I think that it's extra important with multilingual learners because when they come into your classroom, especially if they do not speak any English at all, and have not been exposed to English at all, I think it's really important to have an understanding of what you might be seeing in the classroom before they get there. And after you find out what language is heard and spoken at home, it's really important to start doing a little bit of research on your own. So if a family speaks Spanish at home, then you need to learn some of those basic words that are in Spanish that you will be using frequently. You will want to learn about some of those materials that you're using in the classroom, your interest areas, and what those words are in Spanish, so that when you're labeling your classroom, you can have it ready for your students before they even get there. Suggestion is when you're labeling things, have English in one color and then the other languages in different colors. So if you have, English, Spanish, and French, having 3 different colors on all of your labels. If it's a language that is really difficult to get that translation correct, this is when you can ask family members, see if they would be willing to make labels for your classroom, or maybe you can give them those words in English and they can provide those words in their home language to you, so that you make sure that it is in the correct way. I did make a list of just a few things in some of the interest areas that you will want to start collecting and bringing together throughout the year, even before your students start, after you've met with families and you understand what their home language is, and also their culture. So I'm just going to write off my papers that I wrote here. So in the library area, you can have student-made books. So maybe or teacher-made books. Maybe you're going to have a book about families, and it's photos of all of the families that of the students that are in your classroom. You can have books that families let you borrow in their home language, so that children can be looking at and reading both languages. If you don't have access to a library, because not all libraries have all of the languages, so sometimes you can borrow them from a public library, but if you can't, asking family members if they will let you borrow those books. And if not, maybe they can help you make one. Maybe you're doing a study on trees and they can help you pull together a little homemade book with the photos and those vocabulary words that you'll be touching on during your studies. I guess those couple of ideas are things that would happen after you start the school year, but making sure that you have retelling materials for students, especially of familiar stories. So, felt boards, felt pieces, puppets, Audiobooks, if you can have audiobooks in their home language, that would be great, which are sometimes difficult to find. But if you have families record themselves reading those books, then you have that audiobook. So they can be looking at the pictures, the illustrations, and have that family member reading it or retelling that story in their home language. In the blocks area, you can have buildings, photos of buildings in other places. If you have students that are not from the United States, they have come from other countries, you can have, those famous buildings that they might be familiar with, and have photos, large photos of those, so children can look at those for inspiration when they're building. With your dollhouse, the people that you have in your dollhouse, make sure that you have all children represented, different sizes, different colors, different family makeup, so that each child can see themselves represented. If I can find a picture of the peg dolls I painted, I'll put it here, just so you can kind of see a sampling of what I had. And I was basing it off of a couple of years ago, students that I had that year. In the blocks area, also, if you're having signs, like road signs, not just in English, but in other languages as well. And then when you're labeling materials, making sure that you have all languages are written on those labels. In the art area, you might want to include real art, whether it's prints or photographs of real art, because there are different places in the world that have very different art styles and techniques. You can be teaching those to your students as well, and having them use that art technique and those materials as inspiration in creating their own masterpieces. In the toys and games area, you can have board games that are familiar to those children and their families, so that they can be using their home language to play those games. You can have bingo and memory that has photos with familiar photos and vocabulary. Loose parts, I love loose parts, and asking family members to bring in loose parts, junk, I call it junk from the junk drawer, that might be familiar to those children and more specific to what they might see in their home. And then dramatic play, which is often one of the easiest to include all different languages and cultures. Lots of ways to include literacy in different languages and also different cultures. So cookbooks, menus, recipes, having families share those with you so that they can also be visible in the dramatic play area, cultural props and cultural clothing. But just be really mindful when you're purchasing those mass-produced, the ones from the teacher stores, because sometimes they can be this a little bit too stereotypical of that culture, and sometimes it's insulting. So just keeping that in mind, even just talking to families and saying, hey, I noticed this, or your child is talking about this, or is there anything that you could share? So bringing that in. If you do have family members that have maybe different clothing that they wear, different like a hijab, having those materials there, and also maybe there's photos like that step by step. Let's find out how you wear this, so that children that come from that home and that culture are aware and learning how to do it themselves, but they're also teaching their peers about that. Asking families to bring in empty food containers if they are, have their child's home language on those food containers, and then any kind of props, cultural props that you think might be helpful. Oh, and another thing I thought about was money. Can you get some money from other countries? Because that's a really fun thing too, to kind of be looking at and comparing currency from different places. And the other thing I thought about was music and movement, and making sure that you have lots of different cultures represented in your music and movement area, if you actually have a separate area for that. So pulling together photos, videos, musical instruments, like music, like audio recordings of or CDs of people they use those anymore, having those available for all children. Don't be afraid to ask families to help you, because when you do ask them, that shows how much you value their language, how much you value their culture, how much you value what they're bringing to your classroom environment. So don't be afraid to ask. Okay, so that was getting to know families, setting up your classroom, your learning environment. The other thing is being aware of language development and how that a child is going to develop and learn this second language, so that you don't have unrealistic expectations. So, of course, it starts off that the child is going to be using just their home language only. And so when they come into the classroom, they're going to be communicating using their home language. And then that next part, or that next stage in that progression of learning a second language is it's actually a nonverbal, or like a silent stage. And I wish I had known this many years ago, and had that understanding of how a second language is learned, because I was a little worried about a student that I had, because he did not speak to us for the entire school year. And now I realize is because he learned that when he used his home language to communicate with us and with peers, nobody understood him. So he stopped talking, and he used gestures and facial expressions, body movements, pantomiming to communicate. So it wasn't that he wasn't able to speak, he was choosing not to while he was taking it all in. He was still learning English, but was just choosing not to speak at that time. And then the next phase, next stage, that third phase, is when they're going to start using very small sentences or words that are in their second language in English. I'm using English because that's what I consider my home language, or my first language. So I keep referring to that. So sorry if that is not the case for you. So in that third stage is when they're using, small phrases, words put together to communicate. And then also sometimes they put some English and some of their home language, and even mixing it into the same, statement or same sentence. And then the fourth stage, that final stage, is when they are attempting to communicate in English only, and their sentences and their what they're saying is getting longer. So they're putting more and more words together to communicate what they're trying to say. And during each part of this learning process, these stages, continue to have children communicate in their home language with their families and also in the classroom, because there's research out there that says that children who are learning first in their home language, so they're learning all of these new ideas, these new vocabulary words, are going to have a better understanding, and are going to be it's going to be easier for them to learn their second language, because they have that background knowledge, that understanding in their home language, things that are familiar to them before they're learning in their second language. So really encourage families to continue to speak that first language at home with their children. How do you teach children? How do you interact with? How are you helping these students grow and learn? Well, you're using gestures, you're using a lot of visuals, you're slowing your speech down, you are using shorter sentences, you might use simpler vocabulary to begin with before you start using those words that might be really unfamiliar and more difficult for students. Providing real hands-on material, real stuff. We'll kind of talk about another experience that I had. It was actually just last week, where a teacher who his first language was Spanish. He did not grow up in the United States, and one of the teachers had mentioned something about a baked potato once, and he said, "I don't know what that is. I don't know what a baked potato is." And think about students in your classroom that may not have been exposed to something, a baked potato. Showing them a photo of it is not always the best thing to do, because then they still really don't have an understanding of it. So if possible, when they are learning all these new vocabulary words, these new topics, when you're really immersed in these studies, making sure that you are having these hands-on experiences for them. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is assessing students that are multilingual learners, which a lot of us think, gosh, that is so hard. But is it really? When you are assessing a child's ability to follow directions, They don't have to understand your words in English. That's something that they can be doing. If you are, pointing, you're gesturing, you're directing, can they do what they're asking you in that kind of way? Attends and engages. That is something that anybody can do no matter what language they are speaking. There are some skills, though, that you need to assess in their first language. So if a child is able to count to 10 in their home language, then they can do that. They can count to 10. And sometimes you have to get a little bit creative in how you observe that and how you collect that data or that information. It might be you ask family members to help you with that. Maybe there is a sibling that speaks that language or a classmate. There might be another adult in the building. Some school districts are very fortunate to have interpreters that can come in and do those things with you and help you with that. And then sometimes it's just you are asking them with fingers, or you are having to take the time to learn some of those words in their home language. So you have to get creative sometimes, but making sure that those skills that the children are doing and that need to be assessed in their home language, there's not a misunderstanding of what their knowledge is and where they are with that skill or that ability. Does that make sense? Okay, I already said there was one last thing, but now is the last thing. Children, in my experience, love to learn a new language. So if you have a student in your classroom that their first language is not the one that is spoken by majority people, and I'm using English as an example. If you have a student that comes in and does speak Spanish, having that child teaching the vocabulary words or helping with those vocabulary words or those knowledge in their first language can give them a lot of pride. And that also shows, again, that you value their home language. So when you are learning these new words, you can take the time to not only teach the words in English, but also in that home language, not to just that one student, but to everybody. I know, I'll just give you one example and then I'll say goodbye. So just learning how a family says hello. What is their greeting? What is their way of greeting? And we would sing our good morning song, and hello, Danielle. Hello, Danielle. Hello, Danielle. And how are you today? So instead of saying hello, we learned how to say hello in many different languages. And then we started to learn to say hello in even languages that were not spoken in our classroom. So we would sing those, and then the children would choose what language they would like us to say hello to them in. And then also they were learning about the different emotions, the different feelings, and what they looked like and how to say them in multiple languages, because we said, how are you today? So how are you feeling? So that was just a one very simple way to feel like you are including everybody, and it's creating that sense of classroom unity, classroom community, that everybody is valued and everybody belongs. All right, guys, that is it. I am done. I am actually 5 minutes over, so I better skedaddle. I appreciate you guys being here, and I also appreciate the fact that you guys still show up, even though I have not recorded new videos in a long time. That's it. Thanks for watching, and have a happy day.